Quarter. David Wyss is Global Chief Economist at Standard & Poor's. He's here to tell us why he thinks that this is the case. David, thanks for coming along. Well, walk us through your arguments here.
Well, the main point is people are looking at a slowdown in China. Most of the slowdown that you're seeing is just because the second half of last year was stronger than the first half. The comps have become worse. But if you look at a two-year change in China, there's really not even any evidence of a slowdown at all.
And if you talk about 9% growth as opposed to 12% growth, that's really clutching at straws, calling that a slowdown.
9%'s been the average for the last 30 years or so in China. So,
but is that actually really the growth figure? I mean, because people say it's quicker than that. It's these figures underestimate a lot of what's happening.
When you're growing that fast, I think the concept of exactly what the number is more metaphysical than actual.
Get a dartboard then, basically.
Well, there's an old saying that economists use decimal places to prove they've got a sense of humor.
Well, what are the headwinds that China faces? I mean, we've always talked about the property sector. What other? I mean, it's obviously a global economy. If it slows down markedly, that's going to hurt things.
Well, there's two problems that China has. The first, of course, is trading partners are slowing down. Slow growth in Europe, the United States. That means China's got to rely more on domestic growth. They've been spurring that with stimulus, but there's a limit to how much you can do with stimulus, even in China. On top of that, obviously, they've got longer-term issues, energy demands, commodity prices going up. Those are going to be some restraint on growth.
And I'm going to bring in the prospect again of what happens in the US. I mean, what is the chance of it going back into a recession? I think Nouriel Roubini is saying there's 40%, but he is Dr. Doom, isn't he? So.
Yeah, but I've got it at 30. It depends on who you talk to, and it just depends on what else happens in the world. Bob Shiller's been saying 50%, Roubini's at 40. They tend to be the gloomy ones.
But are the chances increasing as we go in towards 2011?
3 years ago, I said 20%. Now I'm saying, sorry, 3 months ago, I said 20%. Now I think it's 30%. And the weaker the numbers come in, particularly in housing, the higher the probability comes.
The housing numbers were an absolute shocker this week, weren't they?
Well, they were much worse than expected. We knew they were going to take a dip after the end of the tax rebate in April, but they've taken a bigger dip than we thought.
Okay, but, you know, just getting back to what that means in terms of China, how does it affect things if we get another fallback? Is the consumer developing enough or fast enough now to be able to carry the burden of Chinese economic growth?
That's the big question. So far, we haven't seen the consumer growing enough to keep China going at 9 or 10%. What you've seen in the last year is mostly strength from the big infrastructure programs that the government has put in. At some point, China needs to get its consumers buying goods.
Now, somebody was saying to me the other day that if we look at what's happening in the US and we look at what's happening in Europe, it's a case of we're looking at Europe the same way that we were looking at the US 3 months ago. So does Europe go the way of the US, even though we have stellar German growth?
Well, you've got stellar German growth, but the rest of Europe is looking pretty sick. What you're seeing is a real split in Europe. The northern countries, particularly Germany, are doing very well. The Mediterranean countries are doing very badly. And that's going to be politically difficult. It's going to be difficult from a standpoint of monetary policy for the ECB, because Southern Europe is crying for lower interest rate. Germany, at some point, is going to want to raise them.
Yeah, and further to that as well, what about the role of the European Central Bank? Are they doing enough?
I think they were very late off the blocks getting started on loosening. They delayed too long. The European recession has been deeper than the U.S. recession. And it's coming for the same reasons. Overvalued property sector, which is dropping.
Particularly in places like Spain and
Particularly
Ireland.
in Spain, Ireland, but also Italy. Even France has had just as much of a property boom as the U.S. And what worries us, the price correction hasn't gone as far in Europe yet as it has in the U.S.
And that's the danger ahead there for Europe. I want to just get to a political point now, because you were in Korea yesterday, or in Seoul, I believe. And we've got reports of the North Korean leader, Kim Il-jung, going up to China. What's the mood there like about this?
Nobody seems quite sure what's going on or why this has happened. Most thought he was too sick to make that kind of a trip. Obviously, he's making it anyway. The general feeling is that he probably is concerned with the secession issues in North Korea. That Beijing is concerned with the secession issues. Want to get some clarity on that, or want to give him directions.
And, you know, with that in mind, of course, there's going to be an economic point here as well. It's one of the few countries which actually has relations with North Korea, and seen as perhaps at some stage the ones which can perhaps get them the cash they need.
Well, they're supporting North Korea now, particularly in terms of foodstuffs. It's aid coming in from South Korea and China, which is really keeping the population underfed instead of starving. But North Korea has such little room for maneuver in this. And I think China is trying to bring him into line because China does not want disruption on its border.
And certainly wants to know who's going to be in charge as well in the future as well. David, thank you very much indeed.